Thanks, everyone. My name is Sam Pross. I'm a software engineer at DataFox, and I'm going to be talking about my experience advocating for accessibility at a startup. To rewind a little bit, before I was at DataFox, I was actually at Box. I'm horrible at company one-liners, so I stole this from their marketing site. But basically, we created cloud content management for enterprises. My experience there was at the very early days, we weren't very accessibility focused, unfortunately. But that quickly changed as we started to sell to more universities and schools. So this long block of text basically says that a lot of federal agencies require that the software that they procure must be accessible. So, of course, as we wanted to sell and be involved with more schools, we had to change how we were developing. Of course, this was hard. We had a lot of code, therefore a lot of tech debt. And what we did at first was create a separate accessible site in the meantime as we went back to sort of refactor our main web application. So Box has come a long way. The app is very different now. But of course, as you can imagine, this was pretty painful for us to go through. So having all of that experience, a year and a half ago, I decided to go to DataFox, which is a very small startup around the corner in Soma. I also stole our one-liner from our marketing site. You could see we build software for sales teams and marketing teams to help them prospect to new companies. So here, as you can imagine, it was a big shift for me. We went from having 30 people on the web application team to suddenly my whole company being less than 30 people. So I was one of 6 engineers. As of November 2015, we're about 10 engineers now. So very, very tiny. To give you a better idea of what the team is like, we're pretty full stack, so everything from front end to back end to DevOps, every engineer does everything. But when I joined, I was the one who had the most front end experience, and especially in terms of web accessibility. So what this meant was we had a lot of engineers working in the front end, but not knowing what the best practices were. So of course, sorry, this is I know, widely used GIF, but this is how they felt about front-end code, basically. They were able to create UIs that worked, but they didn't really know what those best practices were. So the question was, how do we encourage those best practices? On top of all of that, of course, this is our product manager during one of our quarterly plannings, where he's looking at a ton of Post-its that kind of make up a ton of different ideas of what we could be working on. You know, there's never quite enough engineers for all the stuff you want to build. So when you have time as your most limited resource, how do you make sure people are doing the right thing? So someone once said this to me, I still cannot remember who, but the quote itself, I remember. So if you want engineers to do the right thing, you have to make it easy. So the question was, how do I try to make sure we were doing the best practices and making it easy for my fellow developers? So my solution was to create a CSS toolkit / style guide that we based our web applications on. So fun fact, at DataFox, every repo must be named after a type of fox. So the marble fox, a slightly sad backstory because they aren't actually naturally born in the wild. They're bred because they have very pretty fur, but it seemed kind of applicable for a style CSS guide. So how I pushed for us let me backtrack. How I pushed for doing this was a couple of different reasons. So first, standardization of UI. So we have a few different ways to interact with DataFox. So we have our main web application. We have a Salesforce integration with an embedded iframe. We have a Chrome extension, and it just didn't make sense to write the CSS over and over again for something that looked very similar. Second was that our style guide is sort of a living documentation. We actually put on the page the HTML and CSS that you should be using. So as new developers started working in our code base, they could trust, okay, this is actually working and is not out of date. And it was easy to kind of test your elements in isolation, almost like a unit test, in terms of, hey, is this component actually accessible? Is it working as it should? And lastly, making sure we had components that followed best practices. So let's kind of dive into a few different examples I have. So first of all, one question is, why aren't you just using Bootstrap? So Marble's actually built on top of Bootstrap, but we found that Bootstrap didn't quite fit all of our needs. So one example is with Bootstrap Forms. You could see here, Bootstrap has a label attached to each input using the for attribute. You might be familiar with that syntax. For us, that didn't really work because for our front-end framework, which is Ember, the IDs are usually generated for you. So we didn't really want to explicitly define IDs in our markup. So just a few little things like that, where the exact examples on Bootstrap weren't exactly what we needed, and then therefore our engineers weren't quite doing the right thing. So this is kind of an example of what the documentation for our forms look like. This is all screenshots, so it looks a little off. But the basic idea is that we have some instructions with this is what a form should look like. Make sure that you have labels for all your fields, etc. There's a couple of different examples of how you could do this. And then there's the HTML alongside of this is how you build it. So, how do you do it when there's a label with a for element? How do you do it when you want the label to wrap around the input element, which is another option? Of course, the not as ideal way of having a label that's not actually visual, but is slightly off screen so screen readers can still detect it. So that way, any engineer could come to our documentation and say, okay, I could plug and play these elements and I know how to use them. Another example is buttons and links. So this is a thing that always came up. My fellow engineers would say, well, I know this should be a link, or I know this should be a button, but it needs to look like a link. So can I just use a link? So of course, you, for one, always should use buttons or links whenever you're triggering actions, but then you have to think about which kind do you use depending on whether you're navigating or not. So in our documentation, we have all these buttons that look like links and all these links that look like buttons, so it's a lot easier to say, hey, I think you should be using this instead. So the question is, what was the result of having something like Marble? How did the other engineers feel about it? So overall, they were pretty positive. They were excited not to have to write CSS mostly, and they were excited to see all the examples that were there. Code reviews became a lot easier. So instead of saying, hey, this really should be this, could you implement that? And them not really understanding, oh, well, what exactly should I be building and what are the best practices around creating this form, for example, you could just point them to the documentation and say, hey, this is what you want to be doing. And overall, it's been really helpful for me, as I learn more and more about how to make things more accessible, especially all the things I'll be learning today. It's great to be able to implement that in Marble, and that could be carried to all our other UIs as we pick up the changes. So, for example, I guess the contrast example, that's actually something that I've heard that DataFox could be better at, is that we do use a lot of grays on whites, which isn't the best. So it's something we could change once in Marble and actually affect everywhere else. So even though DataFox isn't quite 100% accessible yet, I think this helps us sort of set a good foundation for where we want to be in the future. And like I said, the fact that we can make it easy for the rest of the team makes it, and actually really encourages them to do it, and it makes them excited to learn more and try to give back to Marble and kind of try to expand it as well. And that's basically it. Thanks, everyone.
Any questions? Going once, Going twice. Oh, wait, let's get it recorded.
Okay. Oh yeah, that's really cool. What is like your workflow as far as like someone's looking at your living style guide and they have that like form or some component and then implementing it like in Ember? Is it like are they manually like looking at the snippet and then kind of like how is that or is it like managed?
Yeah. So um, for this, it's explicitly just CSS. So it's separate from Ember components in that if you are creating something new in Ember, you still have to define that component separately. So it's kind of, and also to add to that, some of our other tools and UIs aren't in Ember. Some of them are just plain HTML, maybe with
Right.
jQuery. So it's kind of more you would go to Marble first and implement it kind of raw on the page. And then from there, once it was done, you would implement it in the different UIs. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
Anybody else?
All right, thank you, Sam.